Shabbat Shalom. On this Shabbat before Passover, it's called Shabbat Hagadol, the great Shabbat, the Shabbat in which we speak about and think about Passover and all of its meanings for us. And you'll remember that it was just 4 years ago when Passover was just so different for all of us. That was at the beginning of the pandemic, and isolation was the name of our experience. And Passover was right there in those first weeks of pandemic, and people were alone. People were separated from each other. It was a very painful time. And I heard this extraordinary story about a woman named Devora who had recently been widowed, and she had moved to be close to her children and grandchildren, to a new town, a new neighborhood. And soon after the move, her husband passed away, and there she was alone. And couldn't, even though they were living close by, she couldn't have Seder with her family, with her children. And her neighbors came to her a few days before Passover. There was a family, their name were the Beckers. And the Beckers, called up Devora and said, we're your next door neighbors. We've heard about what's happened, and we know that you're going to be alone on Passover, but we have an idea. And the idea is the following. You see, the houses in that neighborhood were fairly close together, and they said, our living room is really almost adjacent to your dining room. There's a little bit of a garden in between. But if we move our Seder to our living room, and you sit in your dining room, and we both open the windows, then we'll be able to have Seder together. It was an amazing and compassionate suggestion, and indeed that's the way it unfolded, and that's what happened. And on Seder night, Devora was so moved, she was so touched that you'll do that for me. And they opened the windows, and she sat alone in her dining room, and the Beckers, they sat as a family in their living room, and they had Seder together. And it was beautiful. And then on that Seder night, the Seder is over, and I don't know what time it is, it's 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and there's a knock on Devora's door. She goes to the door. One wasn't expecting knocks or guests in those days, certainly. And she opened the door, and it was her son, and he was standing quite a distance back. He had come up to the door. As you remember, we all did in those days. You go up to the door, you knock, and then you go back to keep a distance to create a safe space for that isolation. And her son was standing there, who lived nearby. His own Seder with his family had finished, and he had come to check on his mother and see how her Seder with the Beckers had gone. And so he said, so how was it? And she said, oh, it was beautiful. They're such a nice family, such a beautiful family, and we told stories, and we sang, and they made me feel like a real part of it. And she said, and you'll never guess what I discovered. She said that our family and the Beckers have so much in common. She said because we come from what's known as the Yeki ancestry, a German Jewish ancestry, and apparently they do too, because all of their tunes were the same as the tunes that we sang for all those years with your father when he would lead the Seder. We have the same tunes as the Beckers. And Devora's son chuckled and shook his head a bit and said, Mommy, you know, an amazing thing happened. A few days ago, the Beckers called me, and they asked me to make a recording of all of the tunes that we used to sing at our Seder. And they played that recording, and apparently they studied those recordings, so that when it came time for their Seder, for the Beckers Seder with Devora, they were prepared to use her tunes, what would make her feel comfortable and her feel at home. The Seder, in its core, is a space of compassion. And it's a remarkable thing because it's a time in which we remember our suffering. Halachma anya. This is the bread of affliction. Avadim hayinu. We were slaves. We've been through some really difficult times. And it would make a great deal of sense in those difficult times for us to say, you know what, this is about us. We're not going to think of other people. We're not going to think of other things and other ways to be compassionate to others. And yet the Seder is centered on the act of being thoughtful and inviting other people. Kol dichvin, whoever's in need, whoever's hungry, come join us. It's a beautiful expression of the way that the Jewish people have to be, that in our suffering we think not only of ourselves and our own survival, but we know that our survival depends on our ability to think of others. And that was the case 4 years ago with Devorah and with the Beckers and with so many others who tried, even in isolation, to find ways to think of each other. And looking back, I'm so proud of our community and what we did in those years, and making sure that people had what they needed for their seders, as was the case 4 years ago. And it's what we have to do today as well, because we're going to be in the coming weeks sitting around our seder tables, but we have to be thinking of others. And in particular this year, we must be thinking of the hostages and their families, because their seders will be lacking, will be different. Certainly for the hostages, who knows what their experience is right now. We pray that they'll taste a bit of freedom, taste all of freedom. We pray for their release today, yesterday, right now. We're not content to wait one more minute for them to go free. And their families. And thinking of what it means to have those empty seats around their Seder table. I know in our Seder, one of the things I'm planning on doing is leaving an extra chair, an empty chair, representing the hostages, and we'll also speak about some of them, about those who are unable to be with their families this year. That's what it means to be a Jew, is even when things aren't going well, even when there's suffering in the world, we're thinking of others. It's built into the ritual of the Seder. The very beginning of the story of our suffering is an expression of charity. Let everybody who's hungry come in and join us. Everybody who needs, come. We have Seder. We have what to share, so we're prepared to give it to those who need it the most. And through our compassion and through our prayers, we pray that the taste of redemption, the taste of the afikomen, of those 4 cups of wine, the freedom, will be felt not only around our Seder tables, but for all who need it in the world, in particular for the hostages, in particular for the bereaved families, for those whose lives were changed in unimaginable ways this past year, these past 6 months. We pray for freedom and peace for all. Wishing you a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.